Hello, it's Scott Manley here with part 27 of Kerbal Spaceships Are Serious Business, and, well, Tatiana is doing some serious business getting to the moon. Her upper stage, or her, well, I don't know what stage that is, but it is a stage which is powered by an RL-10 engine and fueled by liquid hydrogen and oxygen, and unfortunately, it doesn't actually have any way to control roll, so I pretty much had to make the entire burn out to the moon with the spacecraft spinning around its axis. This was far from ideal, but needs as needs must, right? Similarly, the penultimate stage on this rocket is an AJ-10 vacuum thruster which uses hypergolic propellants. Obviously, we're using this because it can be relit multiple times. We are going to go to the moon and we're going to have to make several burns to get as close to the surface as possible. We have a contract which specifies that we have to be below something like 200 kilometers. So what we do is we more or less thrust out towards the moon, expanding our orbit or increasing our apoaps until we start to get close to the moon, or at least where the moon will be in its when it passes by. It's always rather, a lot of guesswork as we're feeling out where this apoaps will actually lie, and then we get the close approach marker, and bingo, we have a close approach. And now it's just a case of adjusting and tweaking this thing so that we pass as close as possible to the surface without actually hitting the surface. Because unless you're meaning to hit the surface, you probably shouldn't hit the surface. Not that the surface of the moon particularly cares. I mean, it's been there for billions of years and it's been beaten on by things that are much tougher, harder, and more energetic than a small spacecraft. No, it's more about the occupants of the spacecraft that we're caring about. And Tatiana, well, she's bringing out her mathematics. She's tweaking the orbits and trying to get as close as possible. You can see I'm doing this. I'm using the mouse wheel to roll and adjust the pointers on the maneuver node, because that seems to be a pretty good way to get these fine-tuned maneuvers. Incidentally, by the way, you may be wondering why I haven't introduced any other pilots to my astronaut corps. I've discovered that there is some sort of bug that is stopping me from hiring any new astronauts, so I am stuck with 2 astronauts. We have Gail and we have Tatiana, and I'm going to see just how far I can go. If any of them die, then they will not be replaced. And I think that is actually a pretty good way to run a space program, to be honest. I think, we have to put limits on realism overhaul, and having only 2 astronauts, and if any of them die, that is going to make the game a little more interesting. Of course, it's entirely possible that all the mods that I use get moved over to KSP 1.1.2, I think it is now. And then I could, in theory, port everything across. But honestly, I'm not hopeful at this point. I am still running on 1.05, and if I get stuck on that forever, like I was stuck with the Interstellar Quest, then so be it. Okay, anyway, we've done our math, we've got our maneuver close to the surface, and we're going to need about 800 meters per second to put the spacecraft into a close enough orbit to qualify for the contract. And now it's just a case of making that capture burn. And of course we run forward till we're about a minute or so ahead of it, and then, since we don't have thrusters that will allow us to cause the fuel to settle, we instead spin the spacecraft around its one of the shorter axes, thereby forcing all the fuel into one end of the tank and letting us light that candle. So there, what a beautiful view of the moon we have from 300 kilometers up. Actually, I think there's a few more insertion burns that I need to do to make this thing qualify for my contract. But, we have the Delta V. We're going to need, obviously, 800 meters per second, roughly, to get back to the Earth. And, well, right now we've got about 1245, so we are going to be okay. I mean, at 1245 after I complete this burn. There we go. Getting that final burn down, and then I'm going to watch my periaps until it gets to a reasonable number. There we go. So that is, in fact, qualifying for the... There we go. We're in orbit, and that's going to qualify, and we just need to keep in orbit for 24 hours. Appreciate the view of the moon. And try to do some science, but at this altitude, we're not at low orbital altitude, so we're not getting biome-specific science. So, well, I, of course, decide, why not? Let's take this spacecraft down to under 200 kilometers and see if we can collect more science. And in doing so, I managed to spin the thing up like something crazy. Poor Tatiana is basically stuck in here because because we didn't want to adjust, we didn't want to waste any fuel cancelling that spin. So we get for that second burn, fuel is stable, and we bring that down. And then, once again, we continue our orbit. Now, I brought it down thinking that I would be able to collect more science data. You know, crew-level science data, you're looking out the window, you're, I don't know, throwing M&Ms around the cabin, eating corned beef sandwiches. You know, funnily enough, I've never really read much about any science that was perhaps done by the command module pilots while they were waiting for the lunar module, you know, to come back to them. You know, some of them were stuck up there for days with not much to do other than read books and, you know, write their names in the command module. Anyway, after several days in orbit, well, we did complete the mission, we did complete the contract, but we didn't get any more science. So it is decided to head home, and yeah, well, we are heading home. We have enough life support to stay up here a bit longer, but not long enough that we can get the next level up in terms of the contract rewards. So homeward bound it is. Home where the grass is playing. Home where the songs are singing. I don't know, what are the lyrics to that song? I forget. Simon and Garfunkel. Yeah. Pretty catchy songs, can't remember any of those words. Someone should rewrite Homeward Bound with, like, rocket terminology. Anyway, we've made our departure burn from the moon. It isn't exact in any way. We're down to about... we're down to just under 400 meters per second of delta V. We actually do have a very small amount of delta V in that capsule because it has peroxide-based thrusters. But... main engines give me about 149, and we have, you know, about 250 in the final booster, final rocket stage. But one of the things about this AJ-10 main engine is that it does take a fraction of a second to spool up to full thrust. And in that time, you can find that your maneuver changes far too rapidly. So you have to be very, very careful with this thing. If you just keep firing it up, then you get a start, and the start really doesn't give you the thrust it needs. Rockets don't immediately reach 100% thrust, and that's something you have to take account of. Most rocket launch sequences have the rockets igniting a few seconds before actual liftoff, because what they do is they come up, they throttle up, and at some point they will reach the critical thrust that the rocket needs to leave the pad, and only then do they actually let the thing go. Sometimes we've seen the rockets throttle up their engines and then not generate enough thrust, and they're like, okay, quick, shut it down. Actually happens for real. But in the case of Falcon 9, they have the kind of reverse problem that they are trying to land this rocket on a barge. They're descending really fast, and they have to figure out how to throttle the engines up so that the engines get up to thrust in time to stop the rocket slamming into the barge going too fast. And during the first attempted landing after a geostationary launch, that's what happened. They were going to come down and they were going to land on 3 engines because it reduced gravity losses, and 2 of the engines didn't throttle up sufficiently, supposedly. That's what I hear. And yeah, it slammed into the barge and made a hole in the deck. But of course we saw that the deck fixed, and then they landed a proper rocket on it. That was really impressive. And then they've landed, just this week, another rocket. So that's 3 landings successfully. 1 at the launch site, 1 on a barge from a cargo launch, and 1 from a geostationary launch, which is like right at the limit. So they've basically solved all the scenarios that they would be expected to handle. It was actually pretty cool because I was watching it with the kids, and The kids were watching it, and as soon as they saw the rocket on the landing pad, they started cheering and clapping, and I felt like, oh my god, I've been a good father for once. No, seriously, if you watch that live stream, it's pretty funny because the stream from the barge is clearly trolling the audience, right? Because we see kind of hints of the engines, and then the thing just goes white and pauses at the white screen, and everyone's like, oh, it crashed. And then the next frame that comes up is the rocket sitting there, and everyone's like, yeah! I actually want to see the landing footage of that at some point. I'm sure SpaceX will post it. Anyway, Gale Porter is the commander for this new rocket design. This is more or less designed to put heavier payloads into low Earth orbit. And the first stage here is using 5 of these H1 engines. These are the engines that were used in the Saturn 1, the less famous Saturn compared to the Saturn 5. This first stage of the Saturn 1 was one of the more Kerbal rocket stages ever built. What they did was they put a Juno fuel tank in the middle, and then around it they put 8 Redstone fuel tanks. And and then attached to that they had 8 of these engines, these H1 engines. Now the first generation Saturn 1, the second stage was liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and it had 8 RL-10 engines, but the later models, they only had a single J2 engine, which is of course the liquid hydrogen engine that was used in the actual Saturn 5. Indeed, some of the most important work that the Saturn 1 did was testing that they could actually restart the J2 engine in flight. Anyway, this isn't one of those J2 engines, this is one of those Titan engines. I can't remember, it's an LH87. This is an engine that never flew, but it seems to be performing exceptionally well and giving me really good specific impulse, so I'm going to use it. Anyway, what I'm launching here is the first part of this space station. We obviously have a command, we have a crew capsule on top, but one of the problems with building space stations at this time is that I haven't actually developed docking adapters. I have developed a fuel docking adapter that will let me move fuel around, but the astronauts, they have to go around the outside of the spacecraft. So the first part that I'm launching is not a crew part, it is a whole bunch of fuel tanks, batteries, solar panels, science gear. This is going to be the first thing that's going to form the core of the station, and then in a few weeks' time, my R&D people promise me they will have a proper docking adapter available, and then I will launch a crew cabin which will dock onto this, and we'll have a proper space station. We'll have be able to have proper space parties and do proper space science, and meanwhile, my engineers back on the ground will continue to unlock the important parts that I will need to land on the moon. So it seems like I underestimated the amount of fuel that I needed on that stage. Good news is that this upper stage does actually have a couple of 100 meters per second of delta, or sorry, it has about 800. This thing is obviously going to be a fuel store, so it has engines on it. This will be the one that handles the reboosting and such like. And because it has so much fuel, because it's got a fuel depot essentially, it does have plenty of delta V, or has sufficient delta V to overcome the shortcomings of the rest of the launch vehicle. It also has about a year's worth of life support, so Gale could stay up there for a really long time if she wanted. It has proper communications facilities that we can we can talk to probes from all over the solar system. And it has the space station science gear. So that is a module there. That's the thing that's kind of just in front of those rocket engines. There is a big cylindrical thing that has a door that's opened up inside one of the solar panels. That was a poor design decision, but yeah, that is the station science module, and in Realism Overhaul, it is basically a really, really, really big science experiment. It's something like 3 meters across, and it requires crew on board to run it, and the science needs to be taken home. So yeah, look at this, it's now really starting to look like well, now you can see what it looks like. It looks like it could be something, could be related to a space station. I'm not really sure how this is going to work out, but I've thrown a bunch of docking adapters all over this thing, and hopefully we will build this into a thriving metropolis in space, a veritable city in space, although more likely it'll be like a shantytown in space with corrugated iron roofs and, I don't know, stuff built out of trash. Whatever I have sitting around. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, Gale actually has to go on EVA to collect the data from this thing. So she has to go over and grab the stuff, do some experiments in deep space because we don't have any habitation modules. I didn't want to put a habitation module on here and then still have to spacewalk around. So this doesn't have anything on it other than, life support and supplies and things like that. It has a camera as well. We're going to be using this, we're going to be attaching this station to it. Its main stability control is via these reaction wheels in there inside the service bay. I think it's a good start, right? Let's be clear on that. Gale is obviously a scientist and is not the best at this whole EVA thing. But she is an astronaut. She is bold. She is willing to step up for what is required, and she's willing to stay inside this capsule for days or even weeks if necessary. See, we can now collect more science, and she needs to do a lot of stepping back and forth there to collect all the science out of that over all the biomes. And then she'll head home, having deployed this thing. Now, I think it's kind of interesting that I've purposely chosen to go for a space station before I go to land on the moon. Because I think, realistically, it's actually easier to put a space station around the Earth and start using it than it was to land on the moon. The reason why we landed on the moon before we put a space station in orbit around the Earth was because it was the space race. It was a political requirement that they get out and they land on the moon because that's what JFK said, and therefore that became the goal that mattered. Space stations were all very cool, but no president had volunteered or promised that in some often repeated speech. Anyway, after doing a whole bunch of science for a couple of hours, Gale gets to go home. So what we have here is we can decouple the node and begin to slowly float away. Or at least I will as soon as I enable my engines. Why aren't my engines running? My engines probably aren't running because... Yes, because I have disabled the fuel flow to it. Now let's try it. There we go. So we start to creep away ever so slowly, powered by jets of hydrogen and steam. That's right, or is it oxygen and steam? I think it's oxygen and steam. I'm forgetting my chemistry. H2O2, right? That's what peroxide is. So you get excess oxygen and steam. Yeah, so this has a fuel tank on board, which you cannot change. So it has high test peroxide, and therefore that's what those little thrusters are powered by. And I thought this will be sufficient to deorbit this spacecraft. I'll be able to just fire my engines, cancel out sufficient orbital velocity, and then I will fall back to Earth and re-enter, and that's all I'll need. Boy, was I wrong. You see, in preparation for the mission, I didn't actually do the math on this, and I had remembered that I had used this in the past to deorbit, and then didn't actually figure out how much I could deorbit. So, in beginning my descent burn, I noticed that, I've burned almost 1/3 of my tank, and I've gone about 1/4 of the distance that I need to. I don't think I'm going to have enough fuel to get home. And of course, Gale Porter, being a scientist, she's totally enamored with the view of the sky. She's studying all sorts of other things and not really paying attention to the fact that the fuel is draining so fast that she's not going to be able to get home at this rate. Now, I did say that I can't hire any new astronauts right now. This could be a very bad situation because if she gets stuck in space, I can't get to her in time. I don't have any place where she can hang out at that station, and she's running out of life support. So things are not looking good for Gale, are they? And those facts, combined with the fact that I'm approaching the 20-minute mark, mean that we have a proper cliffhanger here. Is she doomed to die in orbit, or does she have some other plan that can save her? I guess we'll find out in the next episode. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.